Now on BBC Two, Belfast's Jewish community comes under the spotlight in Odd Men In.
The passengers applaud when the plane arrives here. Ben Gurion Airport, Tel Aviv, Israel. It's an important part of our story. It's an important part of practically any Jewish story. The Passover service in the home contains the key prayer, next year, please God, in Jerusalem. These are Israelis coming home, or maybe they're Jews from Manhattan, or Jews from Bucharest, or maybe they're like me, Jews from Belfast. We're an odd lot, the Belfast Jews. Ireland never persecuted the Jews, says an Ulster character in James Joyce's Ulysses, because she never let them in. That's not true. A couple of years ago, I made a television film here in Belfast. It was based on a short story, and I wrote the short story because of something that happened to me here in my youth, an incident that took place just a few yards from here. I used to come here in the 30s to the Jaffe School for early evening Hebrew classes, and one dark December night, I emerged through the gates and I was confronted by three youths. And the tallest of the trio got hold of the lapels of my coat and he stuck me up against the school railings. And he said, "Here, boy, what foot do you kick with?" Now, I knew what he meant. He meant, was I a Catholic or was I a Protestant? What I was at that particular moment was a terrified 10-year-old. There was only one thing to do, and that was to brazen it out with the truth. And I said, well, I don't kick with either foot. I'm a Jew. And there was a complete and utter silence. And the big fella looked round at the other two, and he said, "Here, do you hear what your man says? He says he's a Jew." "Well, here, boy, tell us, are you a Protestant Jew or a Catholic Jew?" You know, that's not a music hall joke. It actually happened. And I have a hunch it was quite a common happening around here. Common to an uncommon people. People who formed the community founded by this family.
You're going to go back to around about 1840 when Daniel Joseph Jaffe came over here. I believe he was invited over by, if I'm not mistaken, it was from the Richardson family. They're a very well-known linen company here. I'm not terribly sure of the precise designation, but I think it was Richardson and Arden was the name of the company, and he was in the linen business, and they encouraged him to come here and to set up an export house. And not only did he come, he brought his family over here, and they rather unique contribution to Northern Ireland because they really were the dominating family, and they were very much committed to the local scene because, after all, one of their sons, I think his name was Martin, was one of the founders of the Belfast Chamber of Commerce, and Otto, who was really outstanding, was High Sheriff of Belfast in the 1890s, and he became Lord Mayor in the early 1900s. And they were the predominant family, and no doubt about it.
Daniel Jaffe headed the first influx of Jews. Cultured, cultivated Germans who brought with them that rare commodity to Ulster, prosperity. Jaffe's little memorial fountain sits quietly in the Botanic Gardens by the River Lagan. I wonder how many passing commuters, or passing joggers, are aware of this tribute to the founder of Belfast's Jewish community, and a key figure in the development of Ulster's linen export trade. Daniel Jaffe died on holiday in Nice in January 1874 and was buried, as was his wish, in a small walled-off plot in the old city cemetery allocated by the Corporation for Jewish Burials. But the main Jewish cemetery is now at Conmoney. Anglicized names tell a story of assimilation, but for these people it has been assimilation on their terms. They have remained a strictly Orthodox Jewish community. And this is the grave of my grandfather. He came over here with the second wave of Jewish people. East European Jews. They were persecuted by the Tsars, practically penniless. They didn't even speak the language of their own country, only Yiddish. But they were rich in their own culture. These close-knit religious communities had been banished by the Tsars to the bleak wastes of Western Russia, Latvia and Lithuania. They had multiplied sixfold during the 19th century and numbered more than 6 million souls. They made little effort to assimilate and suffered pogrom after pogrom. In 1881, the persecution reached its height. The Western world was largely unsympathetic. The Manchester Guardian wrote, "It is better they live a life of sorrows in their native place than bear the shame of famine, and perish in destitution in a strange land." Yet still they came.
They managed to escape from Tsarist Russia, and they came as far as Hamburg. And not being familiar with the situation there, they bought tickets to New York, as they thought. But they didn't arrive in New York at all. They arrived in Hull.
Why?
Don't know, because they'd been conned. But for the Irish settlement, I think it was more by accident than design that a few Jews landed in all places in Limerick.
But Belfast and the north were to beckon, because for the Limerick Jews, alas, the persecution wasn't over yet. Kosher ritual slaughtering offended the local people and led to attacks on Jewish homes. In vain, the Cork Examiner protested. The Jews will never be convinced of the truth or beauty of Christianity by battering in their doors with stones. So the refugees ventured north to Belfast, where Great Victoria Street was the site of the first synagogue built by the prosperous German-based community. By now, they also had their first rabbi.
Some of them lived sufficiently close enough to be able to walk to Great Victoria Street on a Shabbos morning. That's on the Sabbath day. And there were some bright young men in the community, one of them who actually was quite well known, commercial by the name of Harry Miller, and his cousin Max Miller went around the town collecting literally pennies. He says, "We're going to build our own synagogue. We can't walk to Great Victoria Street." Sir Otto Jaffe says, "Don't worry," he says, "I'll arrange with the Belfast City Tramways that you'll travel for free." But then he realised that this really wasn't possible, that as I have to do, and as incumbent on those of us who observe the Sabbath, we have to walk there and walk back. So they collected a few pounds.
You mean you wouldn't accept the free tram ride?
No way, no way, not at all. Not at all, don't even use an umbrella. And anyway, Sir Otto Jaffe, it came to his ears, he says, "All right, so you're not going to come to Great Victoria Street. How much money have you collected?" And they had collected several £100, which was a sizable sum in the early 1900s. He says, "Give me what you've collected and I'll build you a synagogue." And he did.
And that was Annesley Street.
That's where you used to worship, Harry, and where I used to go to assiduously on a Shabbos morning.
And this is the synagogue I attended, or rather, the synagogue I tried not to attend. I much preferred the Saturday morning film show at the Crumlin Road Picture House. But if my father saw me first, it was here I would come. This place brings back a host of memories. If the service got a bit boring at Passover time, we used to come out here in the street and we'd play a fairground kind of a game with shoe boxes. And the currency we won or lost was hazelnuts. But the shining memory of this place was Rabbi Schachter. An imposing figure. To me, every inch a Jewish archbishop. But as the First World War approached, there was little dignity left for the Jaffe family who had founded this synagogue. Today, a physiotherapy unit for a local hospital.
Unfortunately, there was a very strong anti-German feeling at the time. It was understandable at the time. It was unfortunate for Sir Otto, and he and his family were obliged to leave Belfast.
Because of his German
the German antecedents. Even though he was Jewish, we were told that his carriage was stoned in the streets of Belfast, which seemed rather sad. And that was the end of the Jaffe dynasty in Belfast.
A little more than 2 decades later, the irony of the Jaffe's fate became crystal clear. One wonders why the Jewish communities in Britain and Ireland were slow, almost reluctant to offer assistance.
They shared with the British government an incredulity. They just didn't believe that these things were really happening in Germany. And in the early days, they were inclined to take it all with a pinch of salt. But once they were convinced of what was happening and the need to help, they really were magnificent in the way they swung in to help. The first move, understandably, was towards the south. Approaches were made for the establishment of a refugee center in the south. And you're well aware that international relationships were a bit delicate, and de Valera wasn't at all happy. He demurred at the idea of any formal connection of this sort, and he wasn't at all encouraging. So they decided to look for a center in the north.
And surprisingly enough, this is where they found it. Or rather, they found Mr. Gorman, who was then manager of this once famous Belfast hostelry, which was known as Mooney's. Now, the enterprising Mr. Gorman, in order to make a few bob on the side, he used to buy damaged flax. And he would take this flax and re-bleach it on a farm, a derelict farm that he owned outside Malile. And Barney Hurwitz, in his capacity as linen merchant, came to see Mr. Gorman's flax. And this stuff, it was stretched out on fields, and these fields hadn't been ploughed in years. But what Barney Hurwitz saw was the potential of the place. And later that day, over the counter here in Mooney's bar, he concluded a deal which gave the Belfast Refugee Aid Committee a 20-year lease on what came to be known as the Malile Farm.
A disused farm with nothing working and nothing running, and a house which was closed up and musty, and a barn outside which was full to the eaves with dung and manure and anything else you could think of. Once the farm was established and they needed more help to get local experience, they had a man named Muckle who came from these parts.
He came to help us because our furrows, when we plowed them, weren't straight enough. So he helped along, and we learned plowing the Irish way.
And they came here from the very beginning with the idea of training to become agricultural workers in Palestine eventually. And they never lost sight of this ideal. This was why this was really only a transit camp for them.
I remember, for example, that there was a cobbler shop. They ran horticulture. There was market gardening. I remember it very well. I don't remember any livestock as such, but I certainly remember going out in the very early morning and working in the horticultural end of things. I came here, I applied to come down to be allowed to train in the same way as the refugees were being trained. One time was the man who was in charge of the allocation of labour around the farm. The first thing he said, right, get out and make some bricks. So I said, well, bricks are easy to make. So he gives me a big machine, and it was to make breeze blocks. It wasn't bricks. It was, you know, the breeze block. So another guy and I were told to make these breeze blocks, and we asked him how many we had to make. You will make 150 blocks today. So we said, fair enough, we'll try it. And after about an hour, we realized we were on a good thing, because we were really going hammer and tongs at it. And by dinner time, we had made our quota. So we walked off the job. We finished. He told us to make 150 blocks. That was it. The next morning, I appeared for work, and believe me, it was all changed. He was standing there, grim, Martinet, you will make 300 blocks today. You know. So that was it.
One day, around lunch hour, we sneaked away to have a swim. So we left our clothes on the beach, and there was an island out on the, about a few hundred yards away from the coast. We swam out to that island, came looking for us, and he saw the heap of clothes, and we had disappeared. He went back and he wanted to send somebody to Donaghadee to get the police or to get some help. He says, the clothes are there, the people aren't. He thought he had drowned.
The present owner of the Malile site, John McGill, was then a boy on a neighbouring farm. Did they mix with the locals?
Well, they did now then. These football matches, they used to come to Cardor. My brother and I played in the Cardor team, and they used to come up there mostly on a Saturday, and they come up with and horses and carts.
What, the whole team?
The whole team, and there were some of these refugees who was married, and their wives and all come up to support them, and you know, they had a real good team, and their goalie, I never actually seen better than what he was. Boy, he was springing through those goals just like a cat. We, in fact, tried to get him for the goalkeeper for our team, but as you know, their Sabbath day was on a Saturday, and I think that was more or less the reason that they didn't release him to come to us. But they joined in, you know, and was good sports.
They were very much a religiously orientated community. But basically the important thing was to learn how to live together, to learn this kibbutz ideal, which worked very, very well out there among the early settlers, and it was the ideal way to live.
Galilee, northern Israel. Situated roughly halfway between Nazareth and Tiberias is the kibbutz Laviv. Today, it's hard to picture the place in the late 1940s when refugees arrived from camps like Malile and from other centres throughout Britain. The soldier settlers started literally from scratch on a barren, rock-strewn landscape where little grew. "37 years on, and Laviv has developed into a productive, self-sufficient community. A 3-star hotel welcomes the thousands of visitors, Jews and Gentiles alike, who come each year curious to observe an Orthodox kibbutz at work and at prayer, or perhaps just to savor the scented peace of the place. Bob Redner, now Bob Rave, has been here since 1948. He spent 3 years on the farm at Malile.
We came here knowing fully well this is going to be different from any other place. First of all, we couldn't even put a plow to the ground. It was full of rocks. And so we simply had to adjust to conditions as they were. And we had learned to adjust to conditions. I think that was the main lesson of my life. A kibbutz is a community where everybody gives according to his ability and everybody receives according to his need. In other words, you don't look only after your own interests. We look after the community interests, knowing that the community is looking after our own.
In common with other kibbutzim, Laviv produces a wide range of citrus fruit and vegetables. But Laviv has one special feature. 75% of the world's synagogue furniture is made here. These pieces of wood are destined for a new synagogue in Los Angeles. As for its own synagogue, well, that provides yet another link with Ulster. Some of the money which built it came from the sale in 1947 of assets belonging to the defunct Londonderry congregation. Who said there were only 2 versions of the maiden city's name?
Bob Redner, as you were then, I hope this will be a surprise to you, because when we went to the farm in Malile, there was one hut that was still undug out, and we dug it out, and we dug this out. You have that in.
Yeah.
Do you remember this?
Look, we had maps of Israel. We wanted to come to Israel. You'll notice one thing. La Vie doesn't exist yet. It's supposed to be here.
And what it was called?
Modern Palestine, showing the physical features. Yeah. We left that there. Surprising.
Well, you've got it back again.
Good.
With our compliments.
Thank you.
But not all refugees left Belfast after the war. Many who had made it under their own steam, with a little capital or none at all, stayed. As the province picked up the threads again, the Jewish community contributed to the rebuilding of business and commercial life. Of course, this notion of the Jewish business stereotype was already old hat. After all, Daniel Jaffe had started it nearly a century earlier. But is this the only Jewish contribution to life here? What, for example, about the arts? Solly Lipsitz, one of the best-known faces on the art scene. Solly's an enthusiastic authority on anything from painting to jazz.
This first wave of immigration, they came here, and the first idea was to scrape a living.
Yeah.
Now, they didn't know the language, they didn't know the customs here, but they made the best of it, and after a while, they achieved a certain amount of economic...
Well, then, did they encourage their children to go into the arts?
Well, now, that was the point. They didn't. What they wanted their children to do was to go into some form of socially acceptable profession, things like medicine, dentistry, law.
Like my boy, the doctor.
That's it.
Yes.
And if, for example, any of their children had suggested at any time, we'll say, becoming painters or actors or musicians, that was anathema. So consequently, it was very, very difficult for anybody, we'll say, up to the second or third generation to go into that type of profession. Of course, things have changed.
So, of course, they weren't encouraged, but there must have been people who managed to rebel against that, individuals who emerged.
Yes, there were mavericks, of course. You'd always find that, and I can name one very important one for a start. There was Sidney Smith,
yes,
the painter.
Yeah.
If one were to go into the Ulster Museum, you'll see among the collection of important 1930s local painters that there's a lovely landscape of Sidney Smith's there. He became one of the foremost mural painters, and in fact in many liners, transatlantic liners, Union Castle liners, especially those associated with Belfast, he was reputed to have covered 100,000 square feet of wall during his career as a mural painter. There's one other vitally important area in the arts to which the Jews of Belfast have made an enormous contribution. That is this complementary element. I mean, could you think, for example, of playing to empty houses every night as an actor? Could you think of standing on a platform and playing music in an empty concert hall? Could you think of painting a picture that nobody is going to see?
Are you saying that would have happened if?
Well, no, what I'm saying is that it is essential that you have an audience. That is this complementary element. And it is in that area, I believe, that the Jews in Belfast have played a part which is out of all proportion to their size as a community.
Belfast nightlife has seen something of a revival in recent years. Theatres like the Lyric, the Arts, and the reopened Opera House have been pulling in good houses. But there's one name guaranteed to bring a lump to the throat whenever it's mentioned: the Group Theatre in Bedford Street. Now a valuable showcase for amateur groups, this is where Ulster Theatre made its name. And one man who played a major part in the formation of the group was Harold Goblad. In the early 30s, he got involved with matters cultural in the Jewish community.
It started purely by accident after the Jewish Institute was opened. And I think there was some discussion as to what might be done there. And Harry got up at one stage and suggested they should do something in the way of entertainment. And somebody else said, well, you do it. And Harry did it. It was as simple as that. He had had no experience whatever of amateur theatricals, directing or acting or putting on a set, getting anything together.
In January 1933, Goldblatt joined forces with companies led by Jimmy McGeehan and R.H. McCandless. The group was to produce a string of household names. People like Colin Blakely, Jimmy Ellis of Z-Cars and now Billy fame, actor and playwright Joe Tumulty, Jimmy Devlin, who is still performing regularly at the National, and the incomparable Lily Begley. But how did Goldblatt make the group pay?
Well, he didn't. That's the answer. It was in the days before there was any question of an Arts Council grant or a subsidy of any kind. And the theatre was kept going by Harry Goldblatt, purely and simply with money, his profits from the Kelvin cinema that he owned. It was in Fisherwick Place, and it no longer exists, of course.
St. John Irvine and George Seals were synonymous with the group, but was it always an Ulster play?
It was only the occasional thing, like the Boyd Shop. But then Harry wanted to do other things. He wanted to do Chekhov and various continental French plays and American plays. And so he would try and sandwich these in with a box office success, an Ulster play of some quality. And that's how the group theatre managed.
Goldblatt went on to enjoy a distinguished career in films. It was entirely fitting that he should die still working on the first day shooting of Barbra Streisand's Yentl. To most minds, this is the community's greatest contribution to Belfast architecture. The design of this synagogue caused a lot of controversy when it was built in the 60s. But why a new synagogue?
It was built, I suppose, because the last one was put up in 1904. And in the 60 years that intervened between then and this one, everybody's standard of living had gone up except God's. And this was a matter of some concern to Barney Hurwitz. This is his foundation stone here.
He was the president.
He was the president. He was the president of the synagogue for 30 years. The foundation stone refers to him as Nasi HaKahila, Prince of the Congregation. It's modestly translated as president, but he was a prince, and he had the leisure, he had the knowledge, really to run the community, and he had it in his mind that we were going to build a new synagogue. And he asked my advice. I was the only architect in the community at the time, and I said to him, do you want the best architect in Northern Ireland, or do you want the best architect in the United Kingdom? So he said, well, let's try for the best architect in Northern Ireland. I can't remember who it was that I thought was the best one then, but I took him to see a new church that had just been opened in Dunmurry. And we went in, and he said, "Oh, if only the Jews would be satisfied with this." So yes. After that, I said, well, okay, let's try for the best architects in the UK. And we went for a very distinguished firm indeed, York, Rosenberg and Mardell. Eugene Rosenberg had worked in Le Corbusier's studio in Paris, and he came over, a very high-powered man. And he produced a magnificent model of the synagogue and some very fine interior perspectives. And we had a synagogue meeting, and to Rosenberg's chagrin, he found himself confronted with 700 architects, suddenly.
What, all members of the committee?
All members of the community, just ordinary members of the congregation. I'll never forget the late Sam Jaffa saying, you're building this place to knock the Gentiles in the eye. Goyim was the word he actually used. He said, it'll be a stone round the neck of a congregation for generations to come. In fact, it was paid off before the last brick was laid. Barney Hurwitz, president of the congregation, assessed everybody individually. He knew to twopence halfpenny what everybody was worth at the time. He said, Fred, that'd be £5,000. Charlie, 2,000. When he came round to me, he said, I'll take a cup of tea at your house. He said, I want £100 from you. I was a minor civil servant in those days before becoming a minor academic. And he explained to me in simple words how this £100 could be financed, and in due course it was paid. And that's how we built Belfast Synagogue.
Early morning each weekday in Belfast. The ritual instructions are clear. They shall be as a sign upon your heart and head. The straps signify wedding rings, a marriage ceremony with God. And these straps should be a little too tight, just to show that the love of God can be painful. This is the minyan, which requires a minimum of 10 just men. And why 10? The divine presence dwells in the midst of community, and 10 is believed to be the minimum number which can represent a community. Those who wish to say the Kaddish, a prayer for relations who have died, may now do so. The Kaddish can only be said in the midst of a minyan. And the Torah is taken from the Ark, the laws of Moses, contained in the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Talmudic scholars interpret the laws. They can pronounce on the Lebanon of today or the Arabia of 5,000 years ago. They will argue among themselves. At its height, just after the Second World War, the community numbered between 1,500 and 2,000 people. Today, there are just over 300. In common with their Protestant and Roman Catholic counterparts, many young professionals have emigrated. Others have left this strictly Orthodox community to marry non-Jews. And of course, the troubles haven't helped. There have been fewer business opportunities and fewer prospective marriage partners. There are very few young men in this minyan, and no women. Women may not participate in a minyan. Only 10 just men. And why just men? Is it the male-dominated society it appears to be?
Well, I suppose in many ways it is, because the husband and father has historically had the final word in family affairs and participates so much more fully in synagogue services and decisions in the community. But the wife and mother, I think, in a Jewish family has a very, very particular role to play. And her influence, if properly used, can be of tremendous benefit to the family and to the community at large.
Do you think that women have equal status with men in Jewish society?
Yes, perhaps even more so if one takes in individual acts the woman's role in her home and in her community. She has tremendous, as I said, tremendous influence to bear. She is responsible for the kashrus of her home, which is, of course, the tenet of our religion.
Kashrus?
The separation of meat and milk, of eating only purely supervised foods, not eating of the forbidden foods. She has the responsibility of educating her children. It's her responsibility. She has the responsibility to see that her home is well ordered and that her husband has time to attend not only to his material work, but to his learning and attendance at synagogue.
You shall not boil a kid in the milk of its mother. So saith the Torah 3 times. Therefore, meat and milk products must be kept strictly separate. Only meat from cud-chewing animals is permitted, and the animal must have been killed according to ritual slaughter laws. This ensures that the meat is almost bloodless. There are 2 separate sets of plates and cutlery. Only fish with fins and scales may be eaten.
Today is Friday, and in a few hours the Sabbath will commence at sundown. In accordance with law, everything has been prepared in advance. As you can see, the table has been set with a pure white cloth, the nicest of cutlery and glassware to honour the Sabbath into our home. The first act is the lighting of the Sabbath candles, which is done by the housewife. This, of course, is a supreme honour which she has been given by the Almighty, as she is the one who ushers in this holy day into our home. When her husband will return from synagogue, he will sing songs of praise to the Sabbath and welcome it into his home. Then he will recite a hymn in honour of his wife called Eishes Chayil. This is recited every Friday night by husbands everywhere. After that, he will sanctify the Sabbath by pouring out wine into this goblet and reciting the Sabbath prayer. He then distributes from this goblet into the smaller ones the wine for his guests to partake of. After that, we go and wash our hands in a prescribed manner, not just in the everyday manner of washing hands, after which we must remain silent until the head of the household returns and makes the blessing over the 2 white loaves. There are 2 loaves on every table for every meal on the Sabbath and holy days. This is because when the children of Israel wandered in the wilderness, manna was provided sufficient for each day, and for the Sabbath and holy days, a double portion was sent so that there would be no problem of searching or working for food on holy days and rest days. After that, the formalities are over and one sits and enjoys a relaxed atmosphere with friends and family. Fish is being served for the first course. This is customary in many homes, as we're also commanded to have fish and meat on Sabbath and festivals to elevate it from the ordinary meals of the week.
But there are fewer and fewer Orthodox Jews. As the community grows smaller, one wonders how much longer these Friday night observances will continue in Belfast.
Well, Harry, you've got to take it in the wider context. We're not unique, because with the possible exception of Manchester, there's a diminution of Jewish communities throughout the United Kingdom. You notice I haven't included London, because London is a massive conurbation. But when you take the provincial centres, with the exception of Manchester, there's been a definite contraction. And these statistics show that the general figures of the Jewish communities throughout these islands has contracted. It has contracted.
Have you yourself ever been tempted to go to Israel?
I have indeed. But the virtue of the fact that I have daughters, son-in-law, and 2 delightful granddaughters and mother living here, well, I have a very good reason to remain in Belfast, and really that is the motivation. And then I like the place, because after all, I was born here. I'm an Ulster man, and
That's what I wanted to ask you. Are you an Ulster man who happens to be Jewish? Are you a Jew who happens to be an Ulsterman?
I think I must be a bit of both, because after all, I was born here, went to school here, lived here all my life, love the province, love everything about it, feel very much part of the local scene. And it's a wonderful thing to walk down Royal Avenue or Donegal and someone says, hello Harold, and hello Billy, hello Jack, hello Pat, hello Seamus. And I'm known to all and sundry, and I feel very much part of the scene, and I think I would miss it terribly if I had to go away from here. And even my son who lives in Melbourne says the same thing. He says, you know, once you're born here, he says, it's an indelible stamp. He says, it's with you all the time. He says, I still like, he says, soda bread, he says, and tatty bread. He says, a kosher Ulster fry, he says, is very acceptable. He says, and I've even trained my wife, he says, into making these sort of delicacies.
Some would say that leaving Northern Ireland for Israel is, well, out of the frying pan into another frying pan. Yet, many Belfast Jews have emigrated to this narrow strip of the Middle East at the far end of the Mediterranean. perhaps it's a young professional couple who decide to make their careers and to bring up their children in the Jewish homeland. Often they are followed by the grandparents who wish to be near their families. Netanya is a resort town 20 miles north of Tel Aviv. Meyer and Meyer again came here after spending all their working lives in Belfast.
I decided to come to Israel because, well, my children were here. Meyer and I had this little apartment, which we'd bought a few years before, and we loved the country, always have done. Let's face it, I'm a Jew, this is a Jewish country, and I'm at home here, and I feel at home.
When we first came to live here permanently, I found it very difficult. I didn't know where to shop, I didn't know what I was buying, but gradually I got used to it, and as the months wore on, I found it getting easier. The heat at the beginning was a bit much for me, after living all my life in Northern Ireland, and I found I had to stay indoors a lot, and cooking with the strange produce was difficult for me. A housewife's life is similar, isn't it? No matter where she lives, she's still got to cook, she's still got to clean, she's still got to shop. Now I absolutely adore it. Prices here are much higher now than they were. When we first came to live here, I was really thrilled to know that I could buy just whatever I fancied, and it didn't bother me. But now I've got to think before I buy, and I've really, you know, find things have got very much more expensive. The language, of course, is a big problem for me. I don't think I'll ever learn to speak Hebrew. I know the names for the vegetables and certain fruits, but when I try to string them all together, I get it all confused. There's always someone around that will help me, and with a sign here and a nod there, I manage. There are things I miss here, and when we're out in company, we all joke and say, oh, wouldn't it be lovely to have a nice middle-cut piece of plaice, or a dish of smoked salmon, or have you got a tin of salmon? I've got a tin of salmon, but I'm saving it for a special occasion. But we have to learn to live with the produce of the land.
I just feel normal here. I certainly feel no different to anybody else. Whereas perhaps if we go back to our school days, Harry, let's face it, we were the odd men out, weren't we? I miss the familiarity, I miss the accent, I miss knowing every street corner, every cinema, every theatre, every restaurant where you and I spent as boys. I love Northern Ireland. I love the people of Northern Ireland. I was born there. I was brought up there. I was educated there. I worked there all my life. But now at this time in my life I felt, well, it's time for a change, and where else will I go but to Israel?
Not surprisingly, with an annual inflation rate of 150%, the Gen's major worries appear to be economic. As in Northern Ireland, the direct effects of the Troubles tend to be felt by other people, elsewhere. But this is a divided country at war, and the Jews themselves are divided. What comes as something of a surprise to the outsider is the strength of opposition to the Lebanon War and to the expansion of settlements on the occupied West Bank, only recently halted on economic grounds. Northern Ireland's problems are not the only ones which appear at times to be insoluble. In Jerusalem, we went to see a man with more than a passing interest in Ireland. Chaim Herzog is the president of Israel. He fought in the British Army in the Second World War and grew up in Dublin. He was born in Belfast.
I was born in a place called, this is according to my birth certificate, called 2 Norman Villas, Cliftonville Road, off the Antrim Road.
Quite posh.
I don't know what it is now, I don't know what it was then, but I did go to look for it when I was stationed in the British Army in Northern Ireland in the World War. And very naturally I followed the events in Ireland today with a very considerable amount of anguish. For Israeli radio, in which I compared the history of the Jewish people and the history of the Irish people, because there are a tremendous number of similarities between us. First of all, this very vivid sense of humor, which emerges from a long period of oppression. That you'll find both with the Irish and with the Jews. An ability to laugh at yourself, which is also very healthy, and that also exists.
Let me ask you this. You were the governor of the West Bank, and you had a marvelous record there. And also, you were brought up on the borders of the Civil War in the south of Ireland. And what I wanted to ask you was, did that experience, the Irish experience, the conflict in Ireland, did that help you at all in your dealings with the Arab-Israeli problem?
I would say yes. My parents always said that they came here at the time of the British Mandate and went through all the problems that we had with the British colonial authorities at the time and the struggle here. And then we had even struggles within our own community, all of which was evoked memories of what went on in Ireland. I certainly would say that we learned a lot, and we learned also what not to do, I would say, because we learned the very great importance of sticking together within the community, although at times it wasn't so. And also, it became quite clear to us that somewhere or other we must reach a compromise with the Arabs. And in fact, the strength of Israel's case all along has been the fact that we were always in favor of compromise, right through, and they were never in favor of compromise. They always wanted 100%. And the net result was that we who favored compromise invariably succeeded, as opposed to them who did not favor compromise.
Herzog is a former Labour politician. And you sense that his plea in favor of compromise is directed as much at the Jews as at the Arabs. But if the Arabs did agree to talk, would a Jewish compromise ever include the handing back of the occupied West Bank? In the meantime, the situation continues. And for these young Jews celebrating their bar mitzvahs by the Western Wall in Jerusalem, the only certainty when they leave school is direct entry into the Israeli army. Latvia and Lithuania, Limerick, Belfast, Jerusalem. Coming to Israel, whether to live or merely to visit, in a way completes the long journey begun over a century ago by those early waves of Jewish refugees. The situations in Israel and Ireland are complex, difficult, and different. But it's hard not to feel that that urgent need for compromise applies to both. Perhaps this is a better place than most to pray for it. Belfast Jews, whether in Ireland or here in Israel, have in common with their fellow countrymen a sense of place and a wealth of shared experience. Yes, they have had to remain different in order to preserve their immediate community, but they're part of a greater whole. They seem to belong. Perhaps in our part of Ireland we are all, Catholics, Protestants and Jews, all odd men, not out, but in.